Whether you're starting from scratch or trying to firm up your homestead portfolio to look a little more permaculture friendly, it can be super overwhelming to figure out what animals to bring in and why. Let me give you some tips to help with that. So just like when starting your homestead, if you're segueing into a permaculture homestead and trying to decide on what animals to bring in, we need to make sure we have a clear focus or goal. And so for me, that means growing as much of my own food as possible. That means all the animals that I bring in are actually contributing in some way to not only the greater ecosystem here, but to my food supply. So the first thing you need to do before even watching this video is to decide what the whole point of your homesteading journey is in the first place. Then when you have that identified, come back and let's talk more about bringing in animals. So let's start with a really easy example. I brought in honeybees because they go after an entirely different palette of flowers than native pollinators prefer. And so what that's gonna do is when they pollinate, it's gonna increase the yields of our crops. Yes, honey is great. Yes, wax is a perk, but I actually don't harvest a ton of honey and I don't take a lot of wax. I'm interested in having honeybees because they're gonna increase my crop yields. And so that helps me be a more successful, sustainable homesteader. Okay, so before deciding what animals to bring in, I need you to ask yourself 3 questions. Number 1, and this is after you've identified your homestead goal, what challenges or problems do you have that you think animals are going to fix for you? Number 2, what wildlife inhabitants do you have that already exist on your property? And number 3, what kind of forage are you going to have to grow or do you already have existing on the property that can sustain these animals? I know this can get to be a lot, so let me give you a couple of examples to make this easier. So I mentioned that I live on a floodplain. If you've watched any of my videos, you've seen that we deal with a lot of water runoff. We have a flooding area and I'm putting in a riparian zone. So what that means for me is I have a lot of water and wetlands. Rather than get chickens, ducks are a good solution because they have webbed feet, they're waterfowl, but also they're going to feed on a lot of the naturally occurring insects that flock to those areas. So I wouldn't want to bring in something like a chicken that doesn't have a love for water and all of the insects that it harbors. I want something that's more conducive to this particular environment, which is good because I also really don't like chickens. So now I have a food source and I have a microclimate / a landscape that is going to be a good fit for a duck. But the way that that also benefits me when it comes back to my self-sustainability goal is that they can go through my garden spaces and eat roly-poly bugs, slugs, and snails. And so I have 30 ducks that go through on rotation. They eat in the garden, they take care of insects in the fields, they are part of our rotational grazing program, they're in the orchard spaces, and they're also in the vineyard, eradicating all of those insects that would otherwise hurt my crops. That is the primary functions of those birds. Of course, we get eggs, but just like with the honey and the honeybees, that's merely a perk, and we don't even eat the eggs. So I sell them at the farm stand or I donate them to the food pantry. If you are interested in having ducks for all of the functions that I mentioned, but also having eggs and meat, that is a lot of utility out of one animal species. Now, keep in mind that some breeds are going to be better suited to these jobs than others. Something like a runner is going to be a really good forager, whereas something like a Pekin duck is a really good meat duck and also a good egg layer. On my website, axandroothomestead.com, I have a free duck breed comparison chart, and you can find the comparisons of the strengths of the different breeds. The way that the ducks contribute to the rotational grazing system is they go through with geese and guineas last after the sheep and the horses. And what they do is they break apart manure piles looking for parasitic larvae, insects, fly larvae. And so what they're doing is really helping to spread apart the manure and thin it out so it more evenly is dispersed throughout the pasture spaces, and they help take down the insects in doing so. I had mentioned taking note of the wildlife that lives in your area, and the reason that that is important is because we don't want to have too much overlap. Otherwise, we could create a food shortage. So we have a lot of owls here, and we encourage that even. We hang owl boxes. It's really good for keeping rodents in check. I do have a couple of barn cats, but I wouldn't want too many. I actually only have 2, and they run all 6 acres, the barns, the stables, and the outbuildings. But that's plenty. There's enough food for everyone. And yes, I feed my cats. What would happen if I brought in a lot more cats? Well, it would result in a shortage of rodents for the owls. And they might leave, but what's more likely is they would go after other sources of food, including ducklings, goslings, even full-size birds, and guinea fowl, which roost in the trees. And so we don't want to throw our ecosystem out of balance. What we need to do is create a situation where there's no food shortage and no competition for resources. And that's when we really start being able to coexist with nature. All right, so now let me run through all of the different animals we have and why. Geese kind of get this reputation for being like the utopian permaculture animal. And the reason is because out of one species, you get so much function. You can get eggs, you can get meat, but also, have you ever heard the term weeder geese? While some breeds are more conducive to foraging and weeding than others, they go through in the rotational grazing circuit after my horses and my sheep, and they eat weeds left over by these animals that they don't prefer to graze on. Now I've taken the pesky weeds that nobody else is eating, and I already have them. They're serving as the main diet for the geese. And they're also going around and weeding more intricate spaces like around fence posts, around gates. And so that's super helpful. But the other thing they do, in addition to their down feathers and all of the other jobs I already mentioned, is they are alarm bells. So if they see any predators, small or large, hawks, intruders, strangers, cars, somebody walking by, they're going to sound their call. And so they make great watchdogs. You would think that between the ducks and the geese, we would have all of our insects fully eradicated and it would be great. And while we have bats and we have owls around the property that contribute to that, hey, Finny, we have guinea fowl. And the reason we have guinea fowl is because they specifically seek out ticks. A couple years ago, myself, my dogs, we all came down with stage 3 Lymes. It was really, really bad, and we decided we needed to get a handle on the tick infestation. After all, we live in the most tick-infested county in the country. So what we did is brought in 10 guinea fowl. The flock has full range of the property. Definitely have seen a decrease in the population since having them here. Okay, so now let's get into our small hoof stock. We have a lot of grassy areas, as mentioned, on the property, and some are in the uplands. And so if I had a lot of really fibrous woody growth like barberry, I might want goats, but I don't. I have grassy vegetation, and so sheep are a perfect fit for that. The other reason I have sheep is to help with the parasite life cycle of the horses, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Obviously, we can get wool from sheep, but their primary purpose here is to help us maintain our pastures and to keep our horses healthy. So I selected Romney sheep and Shetland sheep because they do really well on pasture. If I had something like a Hampshire sheep, which I had before and didn't know better, they're going to be a meat sheep. We don't eat meat here on the farm, so there's no reason for me to bring in a ton of extra supplemental feed and resources to fatten them up for market because we're not going to be processing them for meat. We have Romney and we have Shetlands, which do just great on pasture. Dozer really wants to be in this video, don't you? So I have the Clydesdales because they're my muscle and my strength and my pulling power. They can bring in large harvest loads for me. We turn our drag teeth up since we don't want to break any of the soil surface layer. And they pull the manure drag for me, which spreads out the manure in the pasture spaces. In addition to bringing in harvests and pulling in the drag, obviously 2 Clydesdales makes a lot of manure. And they're going to go through and provide us with plenty of compost for the gardens, the growing spaces such as the food forests, and then also the vineyard and the orchard. Some countries eat horses. We don't. We're the United States. We're also vegetarian. And obviously they're good for companionship and for riding. You can use shed hair for making paintbrushes. The other thing that they do is keep our sheep healthy, and our sheep keep our horses healthy. A lot of barnyard animal parasites are species specific. So what that means is a horse parasite seeks a horse as a host. A sheep parasite seeks a sheep as a host. When you interrupt that life cycle through appropriate and well done rotational grazing, you're going to break that life cycle. So for example, my horses go through first. They eat an entirely different portion of the grass blade than the sheep do. After they go through, the sheep come in and they're going to go through and graze. They're going to ingest parasites that infect the horses. Well, they break that life cycle because that's not their host, and so the parasites die. And the same happens after we've gone through the whole rotation and the horses go back through. Before the sheep come in again, they're ingesting the parasites that belong to the sheep, and they break that life cycle. It's a dead-end host situation. These parasites are getting ingested by the wrong host, and so they die. And this plummets the parasite life cycle. That's Camilla back there. She's a Sebastopol Goose, and her breed plays a large role, not just in the function that she's best at on the homestead, but the fact that she is deemed a threatened breed by the Livestock Conservancy. If you go to the Livestock Conservancy's website, they're going to show you livestock breeds that are endangered, critically endangered, threatened, that sort of thing. And so that becomes a secondary tier on what we decide to bring in to the portfolio of the farm with regards to importance. Okay, so I'm interested in helping repopulate some of the heritage breeds. Throwing a lot of information at you today. The last thing that we need to talk about is stock density. That's an agricultural term for how many animals you should reasonably have per space. I have 5 sheep on 6 acres. That's because they all rotate through together. Now, my zoning limit, I believe, is 5 sheep on 1 acre. But the thing is, I want to grow enough forage that I can feed my animals and sustain them comfortably without degrading the land. So I would love to have more than 2 horses, but I know that I can't reasonably feed them without either bringing in a lot of input, such as excess hay and feed, or without really degrading the forage that I can offer them here. So make sure you do a stock density calculator. You can find those free online, and that has everything to do with what forage you have available, the type of animal you're choosing, their weight, their health condition and body. Finally, as a permaculture homestead, one of my priorities is to live in alignment with nature. That means I'm not trapping, hunting, killing, removing any of the wildlife that lives around us. I believe that we can farm in conjunction with nature. And one of the ways that I choose to do that is through keeping livestock guardian dogs. I have a dog that's dedicated to the sheep and a dog that's dedicated to my flock of birds. And in doing that, they communicate the boundary of the living quarters of the animals, my stock, and where the wildlife can go beyond those bounds. And this allows us to farm in alignment with nature without having to remove any of the pre-existing animals that live here. Check out my book, The Sustainable Homestead, if it interests you. I have a whole chapter in there on animal species and breeds that are specifically suited for certain jobs around the homestead. I do hope that's so helpful. Thank you so much for watching this video.